Welcome to this solo podcast of the MirYam Institute. My name is Yaakov Lappin. I am the in-house analyst of the MirYam Institute. Today is June the 5th. We are still in the middle of intensive IDF operations in the Gaza Strip. 5 divisions maneuvering south, center, and north, gradually taking more and more territory, with something like approaching 50% of the Gaza Strip coming under Israeli direct security control. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Gaza, but because I addressed so much of my last podcast on Gaza, I'd like to actually spend most of this podcast talking about Iran and the fateful decision junction that we are at right now. So in Gaza, I think the most important thing to note is that despite all the naysayers and despite all of the criticism, the new humanitarian aid distribution system, the system that Israel has been promoting over the past 10 days, is up and running. It has distributed over 7 million meals within a week. That's an average of 1 million meals per day to Gazans. This is despite all of the fake news that Hamas and those cooperating with it in the Western media have attempted to push, claiming that the IDF is opening fire at these locations, at these distribution points. It is not. We can go into some of those details if viewers want. They can definitely write in, and I'm happy to break down in future episodes minute by minute accounts of what the IDF has explained has occurred at these areas and what the Hamas propaganda claims are. There's absolutely no common ground between these two accounts. So Hamas is doing everything in its power to try and basically turn the international community against these distribution points because they threaten its regime. The fact that Gazans can now go across southern Gaza and probably northern Gaza soon as well to these points, receive food, not be dependent on Hamas, is a severe and mortal blow to Hamas's political regime. If there's no dependence by the population on the terror regime of Hamas, there is no terror regime. It's really that simple. And so Hamas is resorting to opening fire on Gazan civilians. We've seen drone footage of that. Civilians heading towards those distribution points have come under fire by Hamas gunmen. Have you seen that footage in international media? I haven't. Maybe I'll be surprised and somebody can point out where it's appeared. But certainly the outlets that have been promoting some of the fake stories and then retracting it, I haven't seen them show that footage. And I'd be very glad if somebody did and they could point me towards those kinds of reports. So what we're seeing really is Hamas coming under massive military pressure. It's losing more and more territory in Gaza. Its capabilities are being systematically degraded, and its political regime is facing collapse. It's continuing to hold on to hostages because it's trying to secure an end of war guarantee, which would save it from being dismantled. And that's exactly why Israel is not agreeing to an end of war deal, an end of war commitment. Is not willing to end the war with Hamas intact as a regime, as a terror army that would begin re-entrenching itself, rebuilding itself. And so the fighting continues. This is the situation in the Gaza Strip. As I've said, 5 divisions are maneuvering. Israel has full control of the Philadelphia corridor. There's no smuggling of arms going on from Egypt, and Hamas cannot make its own weapons. That means that its stockpiles are going to be running out. But it has reverted to guerrilla warfare tactics, hit and run, IEDs, booby traps, sniper fire, anti-tank missile fire. It has recruited young Gazan men, sometimes teenagers, no training, given them arms and instructing them to attack the IDF on site, localized guerrilla terror cells. It's certainly a danger to the IDF within the Gaza Strip. And it's going to take months, I think, of further combat before we can say that this threat has really, really, really decreased. So watch this space. Obviously, there'll be a lot more going on Gaza, but I want to turn my attention now to Iran because what we've seen in recent days is just so clear cut that I think it's incredible to me that it's actually not the main headline around the world. But basically, what's happened is that Ayatollah Khamenei, in his own voice, told President Trump, forget it. I reject your proposal. I reject the Witkoff proposal. By the way, this goes back to my comment a couple of months ago that the art of the deal doesn't work with jihadists. I'm sure that it works very well in other settings when you're dealing with real estate business people in closing deals for skyscrapers. But when you're dealing with an Islamist jihadist regime in Tehran or in Gaza for that matter, the art of the deal is not going to work. The only thing they want to use diplomacy for is to buy time, to buy legitimacy, to preserve their capabilities, to deceive those that they negotiate with. These forces are not open to compromise, and they never have been, unless the deal that is offered to them is to the detriment of those making the offer. And then, of course, they're more than happy to have those kinds of deals and negotiations. And so President Trump attempted via his envoy, to reach a deal with the Iranians. And so far, this has really failed because the Iranians are not willing to discuss any option of uranium enrichment, low-grade uranium enrichment happening as part of some sort of international consortium that they would not control, and basically for them to give up the ability to enrich uranium. They're not willing to discuss that. Ayatollah Khamenei is saying, of course not. This is our right. Now, I have to say that it's really actually making it easy for those of us who have been warning about the pitfalls of renewed diplomacy with Iran, because Iran could have frozen its nuclear program. It could have agreed to halt enrichment. And in that situation, I think it would have been pretty likely that it would have been able to hold on to its nuclear infrastructure, very similar to the 2015 JCPOA deal under former President Obama. And that deal with its sunset clauses basically would have meant, had it been still in effect, that in a number of years, a few years from now, all restrictions would have been lifted. Iran would have had access to billions in oil sales and assets that would have been unfrozen. It would have invested enormous treasure in its proxies, and it would have basically been a nuclear threshold state able to break out whenever the decision would have been made. My fear was that a bad deal could still have emerged, although I was fairly confident that the talks would collapse, and I expressed that assessment multiple times. I obviously couldn't know for sure. My hunch was that the talks would collapse. And by the way, they could still somehow be rejuvenated. They could last minute, the Iranians could say something, and the American side could say something. So we can't rule that out completely. But as of now, not only have the Iranians rejected any idea of their nuclear infrastructure being touched, they have rejected the idea of halting uranium enrichment. So they've taken a maximalist position. So that's going to make it pretty easy for those of us who have been warning that this diplomacy is a waste of time. And throughout this whole time, the Iranians have been enriching more and more uranium. We know that because the IAEA, which is a UN watchdog, just in recent days released a report stating that the Iranians have enriched enough uranium, 60%, that's very close to the military grade 90%, that if they wanted to convert that uranium into nuclear bombs, they could do 10 of those because they have over 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uraniums. That is enough for 10 nuclear bombs. They still have to build the warhead. There's a parallel project underway. Before I say underway, I should say that there are suspicions that it is at least partially active in order to build a nuclear weapon, you have to enrich uranium. That's one effort. That's going on at Natanz, at Fordow, at increasingly deep underground facilities that the Iranians are producing, at Isfahan, where they isolate the yellow cake. That's part of the uranium extraction process. Those sites are all active. But then there's a separate group, a parallel group. It's dubbed the weapons group in the Israeli intelligence community. They're the ones who take the uranium once it's enriched and use it to build warheads. They have to miniaturize the warhead. They have to set a nuclear detonator. It's a whole list of process. Better not to get into the technicalities. But officially, and according to the known assessments, the weapons group is dormant. But I think that it's safe to assume that under sort of dual use excuses, in other words, so-called civilian programs and other research programs, elements of that weapons group are probably active more than is being reported publicly. And so the bottom line is that Iran is very close. It's never been closer to breaking out to nuclear weapons. It's probably a matter of months away before they could make their first nuclear bomb. And the talks right now are going nowhere. So we're in decision time. This is it. This is a very dramatic moment. If a strike occurs in the near-term future, we will have to see whether it's going to be led by Israel, or will it be led by the United States, or will it be split among the two air forces? There's no doubt in my mind that they have spent years training together for this scenario under the leadership of CENTCOM, the excellent leadership, I should say, of CENTCOM, which has really, I think, in recent months, led some very significant cooperation training drills with Israel. It's also led a bombing campaign against the Houthis in Yemen. So at the end of the day, the military relationship between the IDF and CENTCOM is very, very good. And I believe that there are plans that they have drawn up that would enable them to cooperate if the time comes for a strike against Iran, the Iranian nuclear sites. Now, I've spoken before about why an American lead role would be obviously the optimal scenario. Those strategic bombers, the heavy bunker busters, the capabilities that only a military superpower like the United States has. Of course, Israel has its ways of reaching those nuclear sites, but the capabilities of the United States are superior when it comes to this kind of bombing run, long-distance bombing campaign. And my hope is that Israel will not find itself alone in such a strike. And another assumption that we have to make is that the the ballistic missile sites deep underground in Iran, but not out of reach of the bunker busters, will also be hit, because I'm sure that whoever is planning such an operation would want to reduce the ability of the Iranians to respond. And so I think it's safe to assume that any campaign is going to last a number of days. It's not going to be one wave of strikes and it's over, or even two waves of strikes. I'm sure it's safe to assume that many known Iranian ballistic storage and launch facilities will be hit, especially the fixed known sites. I'm sure that Iran has tried to hide some mobile ballistic missile and cruise missile, as well as drone launch sites. My hope is that those were also being tracked. And then, there's the big question. What about those economic sites, the ports that are used to export oil, mainly to China? And the funds from those exports go towards building Iran's terrorist proxies. In the past, many of those funds went to Hezbollah, went to Hamas. The funds are still going, as we speak, to Hezbollah. And I'm sure that Iran would want to try and rebuild some of its terrorist proxies. Also in Syria, they may try to rebuild a presence in wherever they can. In Iraq, they have tens of thousands of Shiite militia members. Iran's goal is to rebuild its proxy program, which has been severely, severely battered during this war by Israel. So at the end of the day, those ports are military targets, as Israel has made clear when it struck similar ports used by the Houthis in Yemen. If an Iranian airport is used to export missiles to its proxies, which are then fired at Israel, that airport is a military target. And so, those questions are big because striking sites that can paralyze the Iranian economy, that can destabilize the Iranian regime. And also, there are the regime's own targets, government sites, sites that are used by the Ayatollahs, the IRGC, which is the parallel elite military group that is basically in power together with the Ayatollahs. That's the alliance that's kind of running Iran. So what about those targets? And what would be the domino effect here? Because really, at the end of the day, while delaying the nuclear program is of critical and existential importance for Israel and of critical importance for global security, Iran has global ambitions. Let's recall, this is not an Israel-only problem. We're first in line here, but by no means last. The real challenge here is bringing down the Iranian regime. That's the real solution. Because even if a military strike is successful, and then they retaliate, and then there are hits against them, and let's say that things settle down, they're going to try and rebuild those nuclear sites, and there could be more strikes in a year or a year and a half. And so the real solution to this enormous problem is the fall of the Iranian regime. That's the real end goal that we should be thinking about here. And that would not only resolve the nuclear threat, but also the proxy threat. Because if a different Iranian regime, a moderate Iranian government came into power, one that prioritized the Iranian people's needs rather than following a jihadist, hegemonic imperialist goal aimed at destroying Israel, obsessively talking about and working towards bringing about the collapse of Israel, and running over moderate Sunni countries, trying to cause them to fall as well, and talking about building, a caliphate around the world. If that kind of fundamentalist regime is gone, and if it's replaced by a moderate government, then not only is the nuclear program no longer going to be an issue, but the proxy program, the Iranian proxy program, Hamas will lose its sponsor, Hezbollah will lose its sponsor, the Houthis will lose their sponsor. The security situation of the Middle East will become so much better than it is today. It's not that the jihadists would disappear, but their primary state sponsor would disappear. And that would leave them weak and exposed, certainly without any threat of a nuclear umbrella, certainly without threat of a conventional umbrella. Billions of dollars in terror financing would dry up. I mean, the damage to the terror organizations that would remain would be immense. And Hezbollah, could be really just lost after that, because don't forget that they've also lost Assad, their ally in Syria. The Iranians at one point had a real Shiite crescent going that started in Iran, moved over to Iraq through those militias, the terrorist militias in Iraq, then the Assad regime and all the militias that were in Syria, including Hezbollah, and then Hezbollah in Lebanon. And if you look on a map, you can see that created a continuum, a Shiite crescent, as King Abdullah of Jordan once called it. Now, Assad has fallen. Hezbollah is severely degraded. And the Shiite militias in Iraq are under a lot of pressure. If the Iranian regime falls, I would say that Hezbollah would really shrivel up and become even more of a shadow of itself. So there's so much at stake, and I think that we should think about the existence of the Iranian regime as the root cause of so many of these problems and conflicts, and not only thinking about their nuclear program, because in some ways it's kind of missing what the real problem is. Because even if those sites are hit, and I think they do need to be hit, but I think we really need to start encouraging world decision makers to legitimately place on the agenda the goal of causing that regime to fall. There are many ways of thinking about it. Obviously, ultimately, it's going to have to be the Iranian people who take the lead role in bringing down that regime. I'm not envisaging any kind of invasion of Iran. That's not what I'm talking about. but anything that can help, anything that can push, whether it's helping those Iranians, whether it's damaging the economy that fuels Iranian terrorism. I think it's important to start talking about this and expanding the conversation beyond those nuclear sites. The last thing I wanted to talk to you about briefly today is Syria. There have been a lot of conflicting assessments about the intentions of the new al-Shara regime. The Sunni regime, Ahmed al-Shara, former jihadist, if we go by his own statements, former commander of the al-Nusra Front, which was al-Qaeda in Syria. Then he set up Hayat al-Tahrir, which is supposedly a more moderate version, still Islamist. Now he says he just wants a quiet, stable Syria. And he's saying he's willing to talk about normalization with Israel if Israel does A, B, or C, etc., etc., etc. And I want to say two things about this, and both of them are very much influenced by lessons learned from October 7th. Whether we take al-Shara at his word or not is almost, at this point, not that significant. And here's why I think that's the case. First of all, Ahmed al-Shara does not have full control of his own forces. And so this is why I'm focusing on capabilities. I don't want threatening capabilities south of Damascus and Syria, because even if al-Shara's intentions are to create stability and quiet, he doesn't have full control of many of the militias that are still running around Syria. And so, okay, let's talk to al-Shara. That's fine. But why take any risks? Why gamble on our security because of nice statements? I think that era needs to end. And we need to focus on, first of all, the capabilities and making sure that no threatening presence, entities, or weapons are moving south of Damascus, particularly there, especially Turkish-backed Sunni Islamist groups. So sure, it's great that Iran and its poisonous axis are out of Syria, but that doesn't give us the right to take our eye off the ball of any radical Sunni forces in Syria. And those forces could act independently of al-Shara. So even if he means it, okay, that doesn't mean that the problem is solved, because this is not a proper state yet. And there are many, many armed groups still active and mobilized in Syria. It's very much in flux. And again, what we need to watch is what's actually going on the ground. It's much more important to me the actions that are taken. Now, if al-Shara begins to really rein in these groups as well, he's ejected some leaders of Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, I think, to please Trump. But if we see him, really start to crack down on Islamist jihadist groups that have been fighting with him until now, then I think we might see a very positive sign. But I'm really much more interested in action and what's happening on the ground rather than statements. And I haven't seen those groups being reined in. There is talk of incorporating them into the Syrian army, but I don't think that necessarily solves anything. So I would say we have to watch the space suspiciously. That's one. The second thing regarding the intention question is that there are some observers that I've been speaking to who say, look, we don't know whether al-Shara is still playing by, in many ways, a classic Islamist playbook in which he prioritizes stability, the buildup of his own regime, calms everybody down around him, but when the timing is right, he could suddenly unveil a much more fundamentalist face. So I don't know where al-Shara is headed. I don't know if he's even going to be the president a year from now of Syria. Maybe he will, maybe he won't be. But Syria is still very messy, very dangerous, and lots of groups running around. This isn't some normal country that has, decided to tone itself down. This is a country that's still totally fractured after years of civil war. Yes, the Iranian Shiite axis has left Syria for the most part, is no longer a major threat, but we don't know where the new Sunni rulers and their various armed groups are heading to in Syria, and it can really go in any direction. And that's why I think it's vital that Israel continues to judge events by actions, not by statements, by decisions, not by sentiment. And that's why I think those 9 IDF posts on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights are going nowhere anytime soon. And we'll have to see where all of this goes. But at the end of the day, let's judge events by what actually transpires on the ground and give less weight to statements, however pleasant they may be to our ears. And I think that's a direct lesson of October 7th because, Hamas was making a lot of very so-called pragmatic statements. And really, they managed to fool just about everybody. The government, this defense establishment, the intelligence community, all too eager to essentially allow Hamas to deceive them, to place them in a pleasant sleep, and ignore all of the warning signs. And so, we have got to be more cautious before running into the arms of any Islamists ever again. So thank you very much for your attention. As always, I read your replies and I really appreciate all of the feedback that's coming in. It means a lot to me. And I know that this is not an easy time to be a friend of the state of Israel. The level of libels, misinformation, propaganda that we're exposed to right now is at a peak level. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that Israel is actually approaching real change in the Gaza Strip. The closer it comes to realizing that change, I think the greater the propaganda against it will be. That's not a coincidence. That's orchestrated by Hamas. It knows exactly how to activate sections of the international media, unfortunately. And that's a whole separate issue that perhaps we'll get into maybe with Benjamin, hopefully in the next podcast. So thank you very much. Have a good weekend. Look after yourself. Take care.